I stood there watching the local sheriff tape off what used to be the front entrance to our ranch. 5 brand new trucks, all custom painted to look like some kind of faux HOA security patrol, were crumpled like tin cans against a fence that no one would ever have expected to be there. The lead driver, a man who had made my life a living hell for 3 solid months, was being loaded onto a stretcher, screaming about a lawsuit. His face was pure fury, a perfect mix of pain and shock, and as they wheeled him past, his eyes met mine. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the wreckage and then back at the fence, that beautiful, unyielding monument to my grandpa's brilliant, silent rage. Was I wrong for letting him build a trap like that? Should I have warned them before the 5th time they tried to ram our fence down? Honestly, tell me if you would have done the same thing, because I still wonder. This whole unbelievable saga started simply enough, with a letter. It arrived one Tuesday, tucked into our mailbox, addressed to the occupant. It was from something called the Riverwood Estates Community Wellness and Security Initiative. Now, you have to understand, we don't live in a community estate. We live on a sprawling, 80-acre working ranch that has been in our family for 4 generations, well outside the pretentious little subdivision that had sprung up a mile down the road about 15 years ago. My grandfather, bless his stubborn heart, just laughed when he read it. The letter was a beautifully typeset piece of nonsense, demanding that we repaint our main barn a community-approved neutral beige and fine us $500 for unapproved, non-native landscaping, meaning the 100-year-old oak trees my great-grandfather had planted. We promptly filed it in the trash where it belonged, convinced it was a typo, a wrong address, or just a prank. The next week, it stopped being funny. I was out feeding the horses one morning when a gleaming black SUV with a cheap magnetic decal on the door that read, Riverwood Estates Patrol, pulled up to our gate. The driver, a hulking man named Barry, stepped out. He was dressed in a crisp, pseudo-military uniform, dark blue, lots of pockets, and a badge that looked suspiciously like a prop from a local costume store. Barry didn't introduce himself. He just pointed a clipboard at the gate and said, "This fence line is in violation of Ordinance 34B. It must be moved back 20 feet to accommodate the mandatory community beautification easement." I told him, as calmly as I could, that he was on private property, that he had no jurisdiction here, and that the fence was exactly where it had been since 1948. He just scoffed, wrote something on his clipboard, and said, "The fine is now $1,000. Expect a follow-up visit." And that was the start of the war. At first, it was just the annoying visits. Barry and his little band of uniformed thugs would park outside the fence, always just outside the property line, mind you, and stand there with their clipboards and cameras, taking pictures of the violations. Our rusty vintage tractor, a violation. My grandpa's collection of old tires, an unsightly hazard. Even my favorite old, floppy-eared barn cat Mittens was deemed a roaming, unvaccinated pest. Grandpa simply started sitting on the porch with a shotgun, unloaded, of course just for effect, and that kept them at bay for a while. They seemed to hate the idea of getting close to a real farmer with a real gun. They were city people playing dress-up, and Grandpa was the genuine article. But Barry, the lead faux cop, was obsessed. He had a chip on his shoulder the size of a satellite dish. He was a man who craved authority, and our refusal to acknowledge his made him furious. He clearly saw us, the simple ranching folk, as the last obstacle to his self-proclaimed dominion. His tactics escalated. He started leaving heavy official-looking summonses taped to our gate, threatening court action and foreclosure. He even had a tow truck show up one day, claiming he was there to impound an unregistered vehicle, my grandpa's antique pickup that hadn't moved in 10 years. We ran them off with a well-aimed bucket of manure. It was childish but effective. Then came the physical stuff. It happened late one night. We heard a sickening crunch and the sound of an engine roaring away. When we went out, the old simple chain-link gate at the end of our dirt driveway was twisted into a pretzel. Clearly, someone had driven through it. The next morning, Barry was back, claiming we were responsible for failing to secure a known hazard, and slapping us with a new fine for property damage caused by the occupant. That's when my blood started to boil. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was property destruction. We replaced the chain link with a solid, heavy-duty wooden rail fence, thinking that would send a message. Big sturdy keep-out sign. They hit the wooden fence the very next night. Same routine, the heavy sound of an impact, the screech of tires, and then silence. The beautiful new wooden fence was splintered, a clear tire track cutting through our yard. Grandpa didn't say a word that morning. He just walked up to the damaged fence, ran his hand over the splintered wood, and let out a long, slow sigh. I knew that sigh. That was the sound of a man who was done playing fair. I tried to go the legal route. I called the local police. They were sympathetic but ultimately useless. They said, "It's a civil matter and it's your word against theirs. There's no license plate or witness." I called the actual HOA for Riverwood Estates. The woman on the phone was confused. The Community Wellness and Security Initiative isn't part of our association. We've had complaints about them, but they're not official. They're just a separate group of property owners. So it wasn't even a real HOA operation. It was a private vendetta carried out by a self-appointed, delusional tyrant named Barry. We were facing a squad of faux cops with expensive trucks and nothing better to do than terrorize a ranch family. This pattern continued for weeks. We'd fix the fence, they'd ram it. It was always a different truck from their little fleet, meaning they were taking turns destroying their own vehicles just to spite us. It was a bizarre, costly game of chicken, and they kept upping the ante. We felt trapped. The constant threat, the noise, the feeling of being under siege, it was exhausting. My grandmother couldn't sleep. I was starting to lose focus at work. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about our peace, our privacy, our home. Grandpa, however, was quietly meticulous. After the third fence destruction, this one a cheap welded metal gate we'd bought just to see if they'd stop, he began his project. He disappeared into his workshop for days. He wasn't welding anything fancy. He was building something sturdy, something primal. He started by pouring 2 new enormous concrete footings, deeper and wider than the originals. He told me he was reinforcing the main pillars, but he was really reinforcing his resolve. He ordered a ridiculous amount of specialized steel, the kind used for bridge supports and railway lines. I asked him what he was doing. He just smiled, a slow, terrifying grin that rarely touched his face, and said, "Son, they want a permanent easement. I'm going to give them a permanent obstacle." The new fence went up over a long weekend. It looked outwardly like a thick, perfectly normal ranch gate. Heavy, dark wood, nice iron hinges, rustic aesthetic. It was beautiful in a simple way. But the wooden planks were purely for show. Hidden inside the wooden structure, bolted directly into the massive concrete and running across the entire width of the gate, was a grid of solid, 3-inch thick steel rails. We're talking railway-grade steel. It was anchored so deep into the ground and so securely into the new rebar-filled concrete pillars that I genuinely believed a tank could hit it and bounce off. It was less of a fence and more of an impenetrable camouflaged steel wall. Grandpa even had a friend of his, a retired construction engineer, secretly come out to inspect the welds. He gave us a thumbs up. This fence wasn't going to move. This fence was going to stop whatever hit it. And this is where the story gets tense, because I knew deep down that this was going to end badly for them. I tried to reason with Grandpa. Maybe we should call the sheriff and just tell them what we did. Give them a warning? He looked at me, his eyes full of that weary stubbornness I knew so well, and he said, "They've received 4 warnings, son. Every time they've hit a fence, that was their warning. They've decided they're smarter than us. They've decided they can push us around and destroy our property. The next warning is going to be a lesson they won't soon forget." He was right, of course, but the thought of the inevitable impact made my stomach churn. So that's the situation I was in. I had this incredible, almost maliciously effective trap disguised as a rustic ranch gate, and I knew, absolutely knew, that the faux HOA patrol was going to try to drive through it again. They were too arrogant, too invested in their pathetic power trip to stop. They would see the new, nice-looking wooden gate and assume it was just another soft target, another piece of property they could smash to prove a point. They would be driving at full speed, filled with righteous manufactured fury. Before I tell you what happened next, what the final deafening climax was, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have called the cops and given a warning? Or would you have waited like I did and let the consequences of their own actions teach them a lesson? Let me know. I'm genuinely curious if I made the right choice by doing nothing. I didn't have to wait long. It was 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because the subsequent sound was so earth-shatteringly loud it woke the entire ranch instantly. It wasn't the crunch of wood or the clang of cheap metal. It was a terrifying, gut-wrenching boom, followed by the shrieking sound of tearing metal and shattered glass. It sounded like a train derailment. Grandpa and I were out the door in seconds, Grandma right behind us clutching a heavy cast-iron frying pan. We didn't need a flashlight. The headlights of the faux HOA patrol truck were still blazing, pointed skyward. The impact was everything Grandpa had promised. They hadn't just tapped the fence. They had hit it at full, arrogant, vengeful speed. They had seen the nice wooden gate and thought, easy target. But they hadn't hit wood. They had hit solid steel, backed by concrete pillars that hadn't budged an inch. The front end of the patrol truck, a massive, expensive Ford F-250, was utterly annihilated. The grille was gone. The hood was folded back on itself like a piece of paper. The engine block had clearly been forced back into the cab. It was a gruesome, violent, beautiful piece of automotive origami. The sheer force of the collision, the violent, immediate stop, must have been shocking. The driver, it was Barry, of course, the ringleader, was pinned in the wreckage, bleeding and screaming. He wasn't just in pain. He was in a state of utter disbelief. The other trucks in his little convoy, 2 more of the custom black SUVs and 2 more pickups, had been following close behind. They were swerving and crashing into each other on the dirt road, their drivers panicking. One of the SUVs flipped onto its side, spinning its tires uselessly in the air. The whole scene was chaos, a dark comedy of instant catastrophic consequences. We didn't rush to help. Grandpa picked up the phone and called the county sheriff, the fire department, and an ambulance. He stood there, a silhouette against the chaos, his hands tucked into his pockets, and simply said, "There's been a severe traffic accident on my property line. Looks like someone drove into my reinforced perimeter fence." He emphasized the word reinforced. When the real authorities arrived, the real police, the real EMTs, they were stunned. They looked at the wreckage of the lead truck, then at the fence. The fence was immaculate. A few scrapes on the wood facade, but not a single structural piece was damaged. It looked like the truck had hit a mountain. Barry was eventually extracted, severely injured, his spine possibly damaged, his ego certainly destroyed forever. He kept shouting even as they stabilized him, "It was a trap. They built a hidden weapon." The sheriff, a man named Deputy Miller, who knew our family well, just shook his head and looked at Grandpa. "Did you reinforce this, Mr. Wilson?" he asked, not unkindly. Grandpa just nodded. "The prior fence was repeatedly destroyed by vandals, Deputy. I secured my property from further malicious damage. A fence is a stationary object. The trucks were in motion. The responsibility for the collision rests with the drivers." Deputy Miller, after a long silence, gave a tight smile and said, "Can't argue with that, sir. It's a solid piece of work." He took statements from the other drivers, who were all shaken and trying to blame Barry. None of them could coherently explain why they were speeding down a private road at 3 a.m. to ram a wooden fence. The police report ultimately stated, "Single vehicle accident. Driver failed to maintain control and struck private, legally constructed fence." No charges were filed against us. The aftermath was glorious, in a very dark, satisfying way. Barry, the self-appointed tyrant, had to be hospitalized for a long time. His little Riverwood Estates Community Wellness and Security Initiative dissolved overnight. The news of the incident spread like wildfire. The true story of the faux HOA cops who destroyed their own expensive trucks on a farmer's secretly reinforced fence became local legend. The remaining members of their little vigilante group were too embarrassed, too afraid, and too broke from repairing their own personal vehicles to try anything again. They even had to sell some of the custom-painted trucks for scrap just to cover the initial fines they incurred for causing a multi-vehicle accident. We never saw one of those pathetic blue uniformed fools on our road again. We were never sued. Barry tried, of course, filing a ludicrous lawsuit for malicious fortification of property. But the judge, a pragmatic old man who had grown up in the county, threw it out in 5 minutes. He said, and I quote, "A property owner has the right to secure his property. Repeatedly driving a motor vehicle into a stationary object is not grounds for compensation." Case dismissed. The ruling set a beautiful precedent. Our peace was finally restored. The ranch was ours again, secure behind a beautiful, understated gate that hid a magnificent core of steel. Eve. Every time I drive through that gate, I run my hand over the wood and I can't help but smile, thinking of the sheer audacity and genius of my grandpa. He taught me a lesson that night. Sometimes the most effective resistance is quiet, rock solid and completely unyielding. Look, I know this was a wild story, and a tiny part of me felt bad for the injuries. But the bigger part, the one that had lived through 3 months of constant harassment and property damage, felt a deep, profound sense of justice. They tried to bully the wrong family, and they found out that true country stubbornness mixed with engineering brilliance is an unstoppable force. So that's the end of the war with the fake HOA cops. Like this video right now if you were cheering for Grandpa and our ridiculously reinforced steel fence. Subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories from my life that I just need to share. And please, for my own peace of mind, share your final honest thoughts on this whole messy situation in the comments section. Did we go too far? Or did they get exactly what they deserved? I'll see you all in the next story.